Roy Buchanan was the best guitarist most people had never heard of. Musicians knew. They'd whisper his name in recording studios, backstage at concerts, in late-night conversations about who could really play. Jeff Beck called him a master. Robbie Robertson said he was untouchable. But the public had no idea who Roy Buchanan was. And Roy told himself he liked it that way. He'd seen what fame did to musicians. The road, the pressure, the constant performance grinding people down. He'd been offered chances to step into the spotlight, to be a name instead of a pair of hands. Each time, he'd said no. It was safer to be unknown, safer to play for people who already understood. If you never stepped into the big light, you never had to find out if you belonged there. It was early 1968, Washington, D.C. A small club called the Crossroads, capacity maybe 150 people on a good night. Roy played there every Thursday, same time, same place, same small room. He'd show up at 9 p.m., set up his Telecaster, and play until midnight. No opening act, no fanfare, just Roy and his guitar having a conversation with whoever cared to listen. Roy was 29 years old. He'd been playing professionally since he was 15. Session work, backing bands, sideman gigs. He'd turned down opportunities to go big, to join famous groups, to make records that might have made him a star. He always said no. Fame corrupted music, he believed. Once you started playing for crowds instead of for the song, you lost something essential. His Telecaster was a 1953 model, worn from 15 years of use. No modifications, completely stock. He plugged straight into a small Fender amp. No pedals, no effects. What came out of his fingers was what you heard, and what came out was pure magic. Roy could make that Telecaster cry, whisper, scream, and sing. He created harmonics that sounded like voices from another dimension. Other guitarists would come to the Crossroads just to watch him. They'd sit in the back, studying his hands, trying to figure out how he got those sounds. Most couldn't. That Thursday in February, word came that Jimi Hendrix might stop by. Roy had heard the name. Everyone in music had by early 1968. The guy who played guitar with his teeth, set it on fire, played it behind his head. The showman, Are You Experienced, was on every radio. Jimi was becoming what Roy had always avoided. Unavoidably, undeniably famous. Roy didn't say much when he heard. He just continued tuning, checking his amp, preparing for another Thursday. Inside, though, he felt something. Not quite contempt. Pity, maybe, for a guitarist who'd chosen fame over truth. And underneath, something else. Something that felt like judgment. Like Roy needed Jimi to be less than him in the ways that mattered, even if Jimi was more in all the ways the world measured success. The Crossroads filled up more than usual that night. By 9:30 p.m., the place was packed. Roy started his set the way he always did, with a slow blues, letting the room settle into listening mode. Around 10 p.m., Jimi walked in. The room noticed. A subtle shift in energy, conversations pausing. He moved through the crowd to a corner table, sat down, ordered a drink. Purple velvet jacket, patterned shirt, standing out dramatically against the D.C. club's jeans and work shirts. A few people recognized him, nodded respectfully, went back to their conversations. Roy was mid-song when Jimi arrived. He saw him, registered his presence, kept playing. He didn't change what he was doing, didn't acknowledge the famous guitarist in the room. He played exactly the way he always played because he was determined not to let Jimi's presence change anything. Determined to prove that real music didn't need validation, not even from Jimi Hendrix. Jimi sat perfectly still, watching. His eyes never left Roy's hands. For 2 full songs, Jimi didn't move, didn't talk to the people at his table, didn't drink. He watched Roy play the Telecaster like it was a living thing, coaxing sounds from it that seemed impossible without effects or pedals. During the break, someone from Jimi's table came up to Roy. Would he mind if Jimi sat in for a song? Roy shrugged. The stage was open. Anyone could play. Jimi walked up, carrying his white Stratocaster. He plugged into the second amp on stage, the one Roy kept for guests. It was the same model Roy used, a small Fender, no modifications. Jimi adjusted the settings, tuned quickly, looked at Roy. What do you want to play? Your choice, Roy said. His voice was flat, neutral. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. "You know, Hey Joe?" Jimmy asked. Roy nodded. Everyone knew Hey Joe. They started playing. Roy laid down rhythm, simple and solid. Jimmy took the lead. And immediately, Roy understood why musicians talked about this guy. The technique was undeniable. The feel was deep, genuine. The notes came from somewhere real, but it was loud. Louder than Roy ever played, and showy. Jimmy used the tremolo bar, bent strings dramatically, played behind his back during the solo, natural as breathing. The crowd responded immediately. They'd been politely attentive for Roy. For Jimmy, they moved closer. Some stood. Different energy, bigger, more electric, more alive in a way that made Roy's playing seem reserved, contained, safe. Roy felt it happening, the room's attention shifting, what he'd always feared about big performances. That music became secondary to personality. That show overtook song. That spectacle won over substance. Except, that wasn't quite what was happening. Even as Jimmy moved, even as he played behind his back, even as he made sounds Roy's Telecaster could never make, the music itself remained honest. The notes were true. The feeling was real. This wasn't performance covering lack of substance. This was substance being performed. And that unsettled Roy most, because his entire worldview depended on those things being separate. Performance or purity, show or soul, not both. When the song ended, there was real applause, genuine excitement, the kind that said something memorable had happened. Jimmy smiled, thanked the crowd, then did something unexpected. He sat on the stage edge, guitar across his lap, and listened as Roy continued his set. Roy played for another hour. The whole time, Jimmy sat there, watching every move, studying every technique. At one point, Roy did his signature, creating feedback harmonics without effects, just positioning the guitar at exactly the right angle to the amp, letting natural resonance build into a sustained note that hung in the air forever. Pure physics, pure technique, years of perfecting. Jimmy leaned forward, intensely focused. After the set, he came up. "How did you do that? The harmonic thing?" Roy showed him. Angle of guitar, distance from amp, which strings to dampen, which to let ring. It took most players months to learn. Jimmy got it in about 3 minutes. On the fourth attempt, he created the same singing harmonic sustain Roy had spent years developing. Roy felt something shift inside. This was supposed to be his thing, his technique, his secret. And this famous guitarist, this showman who played stadiums, had just absorbed it like nothing. "That's beautiful," Jimmy said quietly. "Why don't you record? Why don't more people know about this?" "Don't need them to," Roy said. The words came out sharper than intended. "Music isn't about how many people hear it. It's about playing it right." Jimmy looked at him. No challenge, just curiosity. "You think going big means playing it wrong?" "Stadiums change music," Roy said. The words came out with more edge than he intended, more defensiveness. "You start playing for 15,000 people. You're not playing music anymore. You're putting on a show. You're giving them what they want instead of what the song needs. You're performing instead of being." "What if the show is honest?" Jimmy asked. His voice was quiet, not challenging, just genuinely curious. "What if playing for 15,000 people is just playing for one person, 15,000 times? What if the song needs to be big sometimes?" Roy didn't have an answer for that. The question unsettled something in him, touched something he'd been avoiding for years. "You think I'm selling out," Jimmy said. Not a question, an observation. "I think you're playing for the wrong reasons," Roy replied. "I think once you taste fame, you start changing your music to keep it. You start making choices based on what will impress people instead of what's true." "Maybe," Jimmy said. He looked down at his Stratocaster, ran his fingers along the neck. "Or maybe I'm just not afraid of being heard. Maybe hiding in small clubs and calling it purity is just another kind of fear." The words landed like a punch. Roy felt his face flush, felt anger rising, felt the need to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't fear. It was principle. It was integrity. It was... But Jimmy kept talking, his voice still quiet, still without judgment. I used to play clubs like this. Small rooms, people who really listened. And it felt safe, you know? Felt pure. But then I realized I was using that safety to avoid something. Avoid being vulnerable in front of people who might not understand. Avoid being judged by the world instead of just by other musicians. The small room was my hiding place, and I was calling it artistic integrity. Roy said nothing, couldn't say anything, because somewhere in his gut, he recognized the truth of what Jimmy was saying. They talked for a while. Jimmy asked technical questions. Roy answered, showing fingerings, explaining his approach to the Telecaster, demonstrating techniques he'd never shown outside that small circle of musicians who came to the crossroads to learn. Before Jimmy left, he said something Roy would think about for the rest of his life. "You're one of the best guitarists I've ever seen, but you're hiding, and I don't think it's because you want to protect the music. I think it's because you're scared of what happens if the music gets too big." Roy said nothing. Jimmy picked up his Stratocaster case and left. 3 months later, Roy heard Jimmy playing the harmonic feedback technique on a live recording, but Jimmy had expanded it, used it not as a quiet technical moment, but as a massive sonic statement in front of thousands. He'd taken Roy's intimate discovery and made it public, powerful, undeniable. Roy listened alone in his apartment. He felt something complicated. Not anger, not jealousy, something closer to recognition. Jimmy had taken his technique and shown him what it could be if it wasn't kept small and safe. Over the years, Roy continued playing small clubs, Thursday nights at the Crossroads. He released a few albums musicians loved but the public ignored. And each time an opportunity came, each time a producer called, each time a band wanted him to tour, he said no. And each time, he thought about what Jimmy had said. "You're hiding." The words haunted him. Late at night, alone with his Telecaster, he'd wonder if Jimmy was right. If his commitment to purity was actually commitment to safety. If staying small was choice or limitation. After Jimmy died in 1970, the doubt grew. Not just grief, but regret. Regret that they'd met once, talked once, played once. Regret that he'd been defensive instead of open. Regret that Jimmy had shown him truth and Roy had spent 2 years trying not to see it. In 1988, 20 years after that night at the Crossroads, a journalist interviewed Roy for a guitar magazine. The usual questions about technique, tone, the Telecaster, then why he'd never pursued fame, never left the small clubs. Roy was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable. The journalist waited. "I met Jimi Hendrix once," Roy finally said. His voice was different now, quieter, more honest. "One night in a small club in D.C., 1968, I showed him some techniques. He learned them in minutes, took them to stadiums. I thought that proved my point, that going big meant selling out. I thought I was pure and he was the sellout. And now?" Roy looked down at his Telecaster. Same one from that night. Same clubs, same crowds, same safe distance from real judgment. "Now I think Jimmy understood something I didn't. Keeping music small isn't the same as keeping it pure. Sometimes it's just keeping it scared. He didn't betray the craft by going big. I betrayed it by staying small, by convincing myself obscurity was virtue when it was just fear. Fear of being fully seen. Fear of finding out maybe I wasn't as special as I thought when I couldn't hide behind artistic integrity. Fear of what?" Roy looked down at his Telecaster, the same one he'd played that night 20 years ago. Fear of being judged. Fear of failing publicly instead of safely. Fear of finding out that maybe I wasn't as good as I thought I was. Jimmy didn't have that fear. He played for everyone, and he didn't hide behind artistic integrity or musical purity. He just played, honestly, for as many people as wanted to hear it. "Do you regret your choices?" Silence. Outside, D.C. traffic moved past. Same streets he'd walked for 20 years. Same city where he'd met Jimmy, been confronted with truth he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. "Every day," Roy said, barely above a whisper, "not because I wanted fame. Fame doesn't matter, but because I had something to say with this guitar, something real, and I chose to whisper when I could have spoken clearly. I chose the small room because it felt safe, but music isn't supposed to be safe. Art isn't supposed to be safe. Jimmy knew that, He played for everyone, played loudly, publicly, vulnerably. And when some didn't understand, when some dismissed him as showman, he kept playing anyway. That's courage I never had. The interview ended shortly after. The magazine published it, but edited out most of what Roy said about Jimmy, fear, regret. They kept the technical parts. The real interview, the honest one, stayed on the cutting room floor. Too depressing, the editor said. Roy Buchanan died that August, a few months later. Ruled suicide, though some disputed it. Musicians mourned. Guitar magazines ran obituaries, but the public barely noticed. A few paragraphs buried in back pages. Jimi Hendrix, dead 18 years earlier, at 27, got front-page coverage, became immortal. But here's what matters about that night in February 1968. It wasn't about who was better. Both men were masters, but one chose to speak loudly, publicly, risking judgment. One chose to speak quietly, safely, protecting himself from exposure.